standing here in front of the Batavia ship's hull in the shipwreck galleries in the Western Australian Museum. This particular ship in itself is unique. It sank in 1629 right off the Western Australian coast in the Houtman-Oberlos archipelago, and was the first Dutch East Indiaman to be lost along this coastline. What is interesting on Batavia, or what's the significance of this particular hull, it's that it's the only example worldwide of an early 17th century Dutch East India Company ship. That was actually, the ship itself was lifted off the seabed and conserved in a way that it's possible to display it to the public. But it also allows for research that otherwise is not possible. And getting very specific questions answered on this hull has given a lot of insight on shipbuilding technology, but also on other things like wood procurement. Where did this wood come from? How did the Dutch East India Company select their wood for shipbuilding? And given the fact that they would build about 3 to 4 ships a year, they would need a lot. A ship like this, like Batavia, was a good 44 meters in length. It was a good 12 meters in beam, and it would have been about a 500-600 ton ship, and would have required a good 700 trees to be cut or to be felled for its construction alone. And this particular building that the Dutch would do in the early 17th century was incredibly wasteful. It was not sustainable at all, and it definitely led to the depletion of forests from wherever this wood came from. Now, when you look at the hull planking here, and you look at it head on, you'll see that it's a double layer, which is very unusual. It's something that only the Dutch did, and that had to do with the way they constructed. But when you look at it, you can see that these planks are very wide. They're a good 35 centimeters in width. Each layer is a good 10 centimeters thick, and they could easily be 10 to 11 meters in length. And you can imagine that one plank of one of those layers would have weighed a good 350 kilos. They're very heavy. But when you look closer at this particular wood, you see that it's of a very fine quality. It's very fine grained wood, and there's very little growth aberration that can be seen in it, which is definitely something that Dutch shipbuilders would have preferred, because that's wood that's very workable. It won't crack, you won't have to deal with a lot of knots while you're building it, or while you're working it. And doing research on the Batavia, we have looked at a number of samples of this particular wood and have found that the wood came from a forest in Poland, very close to Danzig, south of Danzig, along the Weichsel River. And that was actually the area in Europe where the best quality oak came from, because it was a very slow growing oak, and because it was slow growing, the tree rings are very fine. It makes a really fine oak that is very easy to carve, and that's very willing to bend and very water resistant. And we know all this about this forest in Poland because there's been a lot of research has been done on paintings. And because Dutch painters or Flemish painters of the 16th, the 15th, and the 17th century, like Rubens, Frans Hals, Rembrandt, they would paint on oak panels. And of course, they liked to have a good quality oak that was fine grained because it was easy to paint on. And of course, a lot of research has been done on that wood. And when that started in the 1960s, and they looked about 200 of those paintings, they couldn't tie it to the forest in Poland yet. It became a floating chronology of tree rings that spanned from over 350 years. But they couldn't tie it to a forest. And they found the same thing with paintings in England. They were from the same quality, they were from the same wood, but again, they couldn't tie it to a forest. And so then they started to speculate, researchers, that it must have been a forest somewhere in England or the Netherlands that was completely gone now. And then about 20 years later, in the 1980s, a Polish researcher or wood scientist started looking at tree rings in buildings there and tree rings in other wood that came from archaeological context, and started looking for wood that had fallen down in the forests of Poland. And then all of a sudden, all these paintings, they snapped into this Polish forest that he found. And then they could establish that it came from this Polish forest. What is interesting is that of this particular forest, not a single piece of wood has been found after 1643. Nothing, not a single piece. And whereas before that it was very common. And art historians have been saying for the last 30 years that it must have been tied to shipbuilding, and that the Dutch, but also other European nations, would have used so much of this really fine quality, nice oak for shipbuilding that by the time of 1643, there was nothing left, and it was all gone. We have no archives that could have confirmed that from the Dutch libraries or from the Dutch East India Company libraries, because the Dutch East India Company archives of the early 17th century are incomplete. And those things that would have given us a lot of information on wood trade are simply missing. So looking at the Batavia wood and all of a sudden realizing that this wood also came from the same forest that of which the timber was used by those painters, all of a sudden made us realize that the Dutch East India Company probably had a huge influence on depleting those forests, given the fact that they would build several ships a year for many years on a row. And this particular way of constructing ships, with you having a really thick skin in 2 layers, would have used an immense amount of that type of trees, and would have easily depleted a forest. And you can imagine, you know, if you're Rembrandt and you're living in Amsterdam, there are no places you can go to get your timber. There are no timber markets or stores as we know today. Like, you can't just go to Bunnings and pick up a panel because you want to make a painting. And where would you go? We've always thought or played with the idea that he would go to the shipyard where Batavia would have been built and just gotten his wood from there.